So welcome everybody. Sorry for the technical delays. Thank you so much for joining us today on behalf of Rock Coalition Against Anti-Semitism, or BCAA, and Chabad Rock. I want to thank you for coming to our event, Rising from the Silence, Feminists and the October 7th Atrocities. So we're here today to try to find an answer to a simple but very urgent question. Why have the world's feminists, progressive community, and the world as a whole remained stubbornly silent about Hamas's brutal sexual atrocities against Jewish women and some men on and since October 7th? That's our question. How is it possible that despite mountains of evidence, including graphic footage that Hamas itself proudly posted online, detailed eyewitness testimony, and forensic evidence, that prominent feminists and other leading voices on the left are still denying or ignoring the fact that Hamas used and is using sexual violence as a weapon of war? How is it possible that social justice activists are marching down the streets and across campuses singing the praises of an organization which planned and carried out, documented and boasted about the rape, gang rape, necro-rape, rape with weapons, sexual mutilation, sexual torture, and murder of Jewish women? How is it possible that renowned gender studies scholar and public intellectual Judith Butler can call Hamas's genocidal onslaught on October 7th, in which babies were burned alive, whole families brutally murdered in their homes, children, the elderly, women and men taken hostage, as an act of resistance? Where is global feminist solidarity with the 14 female hostages who have been languishing in dark, dank, airless tunnels deep under the ground in Gaza for 181 days, that's 6 months this Sunday, suffering from serious, untreated injuries, some of which occurred during violent rape and sexual assault, and who are facing ongoing rape and sexual assault by their captors? Where are the marches on the streets loudly condemning Hamas's brutal use of sexual violence as a weapon of war? To help us make sense of this painful reality, we have invited two esteemed panelists to share their insights with us. So, Marcia Barber is a poet and a professor in the School of Journalism at Toronto Metropolitan University. She's been there since 1999. Her academic research focuses, among other things, on gender representation and bias in the media. Marcia was a senior producer and documentary producer at the CBC's The National, where she specialized in investigative pieces for which she won several awards. She has also worked for CTV and TV Ontario, and as a freelancer for the Globe and Mail, Canadian Press, the Toronto Star, among other media organizations. Marcia is also an accomplished and prize-winning poet. She has written 3 acclaimed books of poetry, including Love You to Pieces, published in 2019, All the Lovely Broken People, published in 2015, and What is the Sound of Someone Unraveled?
And Kaddish for My Mother in 2022.
Ah, there we go. That was one I should have started with. Thank you so much. Sorry for missing that. Okay, so I'll introduce Phoebe, and then I'm going to introduce the video that we're going to watch, and then we'll return to our panelists. So we have a panelist here as well, Phoebe Maltz-Bowlby, who is joining us from Toronto in her home. So originally from New York, but now based in Toronto, Phoebe is an author, cultural critic, and senior editor for Canadian Jewish News, and a contributing columnist to the Globe and Mail. Phoebe holds a doctorate in French and French Studies from New York University. She is also a co-host with Kat Rosenfield of the Feminine Chaos podcast, which is lots of fun and very interesting to listen to. Her newsletter, Close Reading the Reruns, discusses contemporary North American issues in relation to 1990s British sitcoms. Her articles appear in a variety of publications across North America, including The New Republic, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Journal of Jewish Identities, The New Inquiry, Tablet, and many others. In 2017, Phoebe published The Perils of Privilege, Why Injustice Can't Be Solved by Accusing Others of Advantage, in which she explores the rhetorical power of the term privilege and its impact on social justice discourse and activism. So first, let's just give our panelists a round of applause, please. Okay, as I said, before we turn to our speakers, we're going to watch and listen to a 30-minute episode of Barry Weiss's podcast, Honestly, which is aptly titled, Why Are Feminists Silent on Rape and Murder? Weiss is the founder and editor of the independent media company The Free Press, and former opinion writer and editor at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. In this episode, which was recorded 100 days into the war, Weiss addresses the hypocrisy, the double standards, the lies, and the betrayals that I was talking about earlier head on, and helps set the stage for our panel discussion. So now we will turn our attention to the screen and see what she has to say. Okay, so a lot to absorb there, and we're going to turn first actually to Phoebe in the end. That's okay because she has child care responsibilities right at 5. So we'll start with our, yes, thank you. Our panelist Phoebe will comment on what we've just seen and enlighten us in other ways on what's going on here with this silence and denial and vitriol.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm not going to talk specifically about what Barry Weiss said, but just sort of about the topic more generally, if that's all right.
Sure,
yeah. So the first thing I saw about October 7th was not a news alert. Rather, it was a non-Jewish Twitter, or now X, mutual, someone active in British feminist circles calling out those other feminists for their refusal to condemn horrific sexual assaults in Israel. So it would be a few minutes before I learned that this was in reference to something to do with a large-scale attack. But it was already clear that something had happened and that teams were already kind of forming according to pre-existing political and culture wars divides, so in the English-speaking world at least. So since October 7th, there has been a ton of discussion, especially on the pro-Israel side, about why the people you'd expect to care about this did not appear to do so. The usual suspects, the Believe Women crowd, the people losing sleep over the possibility that somewhere a 23-year-old woman is going on a date with her 43-year-old former professor. Think of the power imbalances. Where were the people like this? Why were they silent? So the silence itself was and is real. Pro-Palestinian progressives would very often wouldn't comment or would say it didn't happen. Efforts to discredit reporting on this continue, or you get people who don't have any interest in denying anything about the events of October 7th, who consider them nevertheless to have been heroic resistance, or you get people who say that it doesn't matter what happened that day if you consider all that's happened since. And also you get people who say that, sure, it's bad that Hamas used and uses rape as a weapon, but that, rather people who say that if you say that, you are basically endorsing if Netanyahu wants to continue the war for the next 50 years, that's fantastic. So you get a range of views. My interpretation is a little different. So I found it distressing, certainly, that so many reacted as callously as they did to the sexual violence of October 7th, but I did not find it surprising. I found it very much expected. And to get at why I found it expected, you have to first sort of set aside questions specific to do with the Middle East or even to do with Jews or anti-Semitism and look at the place of feminism in the culture at October 2023, basically. So there had been a big wave of interest in feminism among progressives earlier. And this really, really got underway when Hillary Clinton lost the US presidential election to Donald Trump, of all people, in 2016. And it continued on into the Me Too movement, starting in 2017 with a spate of articles, investigative articles about movie producer Harvey Weinstein and other prominent men's misdeeds. Even in seemingly liberal parts of the world, a lot of discussions of women's safety. This really dominated. And the threat of
Phoebe, hold on a second.
We're having some technical problems.
We're losing you. Hold on a second. Yeah, I think it's at your end because here I have both screens and they're both pausing. Okay, I think we have you back. Please continue. We lost about 30 seconds.
Okay, I'm sure that. So I was saying that there had been a certain cultural mood from 2017 to 2020. Are we there? Is that all right?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So basically, I think this all changed around 2020 and 2021. So following the really tragic police killing of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement became the new center of social justice activity in the US and beyond. It's not that this exactly displaced feminism as a concern, but it changed things around so that any feminism that wasn't presenting itself as explicitly intersectional, now it came across as basically a form of racism. So in 2018, if a white woman said that she was too scared to ride the subway alone at night and maybe wrote a personal essay about this or a song, or even songs that I remember these days, that would have gotten these kind of solemn nods of understanding. She was a woman living in a rape culture, and that's so hard to be a woman. In 2021, if a white woman made that sort of remark, she would be called something else, namely a Karen. So I don't know if Karens are still a thing, and I don't know if undergrads today even know what a Karen is. Maybe it's too long ago. But during the pandemic, one heard of little else. A Karen was a white woman, usually of a certain age, who did something like see a racialized family having a barbecue and call the police because she was so scared. But she was also many other things, and there were these Karen videos. The Karen wasn't always even white, but basically it was any time a woman was being annoying and was not, particularly if she was a bit older or not very attractive, she was a Karen. So the Karen became this whole thing, and this sort of the Sheryl Sandberg lean in idea that women should be more assertive was very much out of style. So what I'm saying is that if you look at where things were on October 6th, there really wasn't a progressive cohesion around the idea that women as such were a marginalized group, nor that women's safety was something that the left should be prioritizing. Again, to be clear, it wasn't just that women's safety now ranked lower than it had on a list of progressive concerns, but rather that it had been recast as a reactionary thing to bring up in the first place, unless there was an intersectional angle. Now, you might think if you include anti-Semitism with misogyny, you get an intersectional angle, right? Well, not how it plays out. So opposing anti-Semitism also has become right-wing coded. The left is against settler colonialism and against white supremacy and has decided that Israel is both of those things. It is therefore not surprising in the least that a cause that's at the intersection of women's safety and anti-Jewish hatred, namely raising awareness of Hamas's sexual violence on October 7th and moving forward, that this topic has not gotten a warm reception from progressives. So what I would say, sorry, where am I for time? Is there? Sorry?
Another 5 minutes? Another 5 minutes?
Okay,
something like that.
Thank you. Okay, so I was just going to say, though, that the discussion around fighting anti-Semitism that happens within the Jewish community does take for granted that society at large, barring a few misled people on the fringes, sees anti-Semitism as a bad thing, and sees our project as essentially teaching well-meaning people how to avoid committing anti-Semitic microaggressions. And I think that that is not the conversation we need to be having now. We need to be aware of the extent to which, as was already the case in Europe, is now becoming more the case in North America, there's this mistaken belief that being nasty to Jews locally is somehow helpful to Palestinians, helpful to ending the war. And basically, I keep seeing variations of the same point coming from basically the left, although that's kind of oversimplifying. But basically that if North American Jews feel scared or sad, this is nothing compared to being a child in war-torn Gaza. And I would not dispute that. War is worse than casual anti-Semitism. It's also worse than any form of casual bigotry that's happening in an overall peaceful environment. So my question for people who make that sort of it could be worse argument is whether it somehow helps Palestinians or helps end the war and solve the conflict to terrorize one's local Jewish community. I can see ways doing so makes Jews, and not only Jews, more pro-Israel and less inclined to make even valid criticisms of Israel, and specifically the way it's running this war. But that's really all I can see it doing. So I don't really think that the fighting anti-Semitism strategy of reminding that diaspora Jews are not Israelis and not responsible for Israel's military decisions is really accomplishing a ton at this point. I'm not sure anything would help, to be honest. I'm pretty pessimistic, but what I do think would be more productive is to address head on this implicit idea that giving diaspora Jews a hard time in day-to-day life is a way of putting pressure on the Israeli government to make different choices. And devoid of any righteous pretext, anti-Semitism starts to look, even to some of the previously unconvinced, like the hatred it is. And I think that if we sort of reframe things a bit, maybe we will get a few more people caring about the sexual violence of October 7th. But once again, I was not personally surprised by any of it. Upset, but not surprised. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for shedding light on that and on sort of where this issue comes from within feminist discourse and activism and social justice activism more broadly. We'll move now to Marcia's talk, and then at the end we'll have questions for everybody together. Okay, so please take it away, Marcia.
Yes, hi. I'm going to stand up so I can see everyone and so I don't block out Phoebe on the screen. I'll just move over here so I can see you properly. First of all, thanks to Danny, thanks to Zipporah, thanks for inviting me. My son actually went to Brock. He was in health sciences at Brock, so it's good to be back on campus, even to talk about something as disturbing as this. And I am going to be referencing the video quite extensively and using Barry Weiss, as she calls herself, as a jumping off point for that. Now, I don't usually like to read what I say, but I think it's really important to get this right. So I am going to be looking down at my notes quite a bit, so I'm warning you about that in advance. And I will ask, I don't think anyone's videoing, but because it's such a fraught topic, I'd appreciate you not doing that. Okay, so what we watched, and I want to mention first, I really loved, I appreciated, Phoebe, everything you had to say, especially when it came to intersectional feminism. That is exactly what I'm seeing in academia. That's exactly what I'm seeing at my university. And I think it's a really good way of understanding what's happening. So thank you, Phoebe. And in terms of the video, Barry Weiss's video, it's an extremely powerful and disturbing jumping off point to talk about why feminists across the board ignored 710. And I'm sure this is true for many of you. I've considered myself a feminist since before I knew the meaning of the word. But since October the 7th, as a Jew, as a feminist, I've lost my political home on a number of levels. I'm hearing the same from many Jews I know. So why have fellow feminists remained so silent about October the 7th? I'm going to offer another perspective then. And as you've heard, these are the women who supported Me Too, the same women who said #believe her when women reported sexual assaults, the same women who condemned Boko Haram, as Barry Weiss said. Suddenly, they've gone silent. And Weiss gave three main reasons why she believes this is happening. And I want to expand upon them and add to them. The most interesting and most disturbing to me is what Weiss says about how the left is immersed in the belief that the world is divided plainly into the oppressor and the oppressed. This is a simplistic and ultimately dangerous worldview. I've seen it reflected in course discussions and amplified within student groups on campus, but the problem is it holds no intellectual weight. Now, Darrell Horn, if many of you are familiar with her perhaps, she wrote a brilliant book, Everyone Loves Dead Jews. I spent a lot of time in Israel, and I remember when the rest of the world seemed to see Israel as David to the powerful Goliath of the Arab world. In those days, Israel had a lot of global support, and I'm sure many of you remember that. When Israeli athletes were killed, for example, at the 1972 Munich Olympics, the world rallied behind Israel. It was seen as the ultimate underdog. Now, however, partly due to a brilliant PR campaign, the tables have turned. Feminists appear indifferent to Israel because it's now seen as Goliath. And in this world of facile binaries, Israel is the oppressor, no longer the oppressed. It's in the nature of the left, including feminists, to root for the underdog. And this is what we're seeing playing out. In terms of being oppressed, let's explore this for a minute. And I put this together thinking that there would probably be many people in the room who weren't as familiar with the issues. I think most of you are for the broad coalition against anti-Semitism, so this will be familiar to you. But in case there are people here for whom it's not familiar, I want to see this too. So in terms of being oppressed, if Israel lost its perennial existential battle for survival, the majority of Israeli Jews would have nowhere to go. More than 850,000 Jews were forced out of Arab states and Iran during the last century. Many fled to Israel, and their descendants still live there. Only a third are Ashkenazi, of Central and Eastern European descent. And while we're talking demographics and the oppressor versus the oppressed, to bring this back to Barry Weiss, just over a fifth of Israelis are Arab. Those Israeli Arabs hold posts as parliamentarians, journalists, judges, have a vote in all elections. The system isn't ideal, as many of you know. There's racism, inequality, and poverty in minority communities, just as there is in many countries. But according to Reuters, a November poll suggested 70% of Israeli Arabs say they feel, quote unquote, part of the country. The war against Hamas has dramatically increased their sense of solidarity with Israel. So when someone says they're an anti-Zionist, they're denying Arab Israelis their country too. The binary of oppressor and oppressed doesn't hold up. Nothing is simple. Second, in terms of why feminists haven't spoken up, Weiss mentioned concern about choosing sides. Peer pressure is daunting, and to be out of step with your peers, to take a pro-Zionist stand, or to express sympathy with women who were brutalized is a risk many are not prepared to take. Third, Weiss proposes the fact that those women on October the 7th were Israelis, and they were Jews, as the reason feminists were silenced. If you don't think that's true, ask yourself where people's sympathies would have been if a group of women from Hamilton or somewhere else in Ontario had been brutalized in this way. Would they talk about context, or would they agree that this savagery is wrong under any circumstances? Now, an article I found interesting was written by Letty Cotton Pogrebin, who was the founder of Ms. Magazine. Anyone remember Ms. Magazine? in 1982? Yes, okay. And it was an article called Anti-Semitism in the Women's Movement. So this isn't new. The article discusses accusations that Jews created the patriarchy and questions about Jewish dual loyalty, among other things. Pogrebin is still going strong and wrote about the feminist betrayal at the end of last year. Like many Jews, she's been advocating for Palestinian statehood. But as she tries to understand feminist indifference, she writes she's not sure the atrocities on October 7th were ignored because they happened in Israel, or because the current political climate has allowed anti-Semitism to go mainstream. None of this is new. Anti-Semitism became a particularly serious problem on the left in the late 19th century, as anti-Semitism became a political force in the modern world. The left said Jews were, quote, cosmopolitans and Zionists, unquote. As cosmopolitans, more loyal to each other across national borders, and as Zionists, more loyal to a foreign state. So in addition to Weiss's reasons for feminist silence, here's a possible fourth reason. Many on the left claim to see the world as post-national. At the same time, they call for a national state, the Palestinians, and they call for self-determination for Palestinians, but not for Jews. People who say they're post-national resist the very idea of Israel. And let's talk about anti-Zionism as its own fifth category, as it relates to Weiss's contention that feminists ignored what happened to the women because they were Israelis and Jews. And I use the term Zionist here, by the way, in its actual sense, to describe someone who believes the state of Israel has a right to exist, and Jews have the right to self-determination in their homeland. Clara Lemlich, Rose Schneiderman, Emma Lazarus, and later in the 20th century, Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, Leah Rabin, and Letty Cotton Pogrebin, huge names in the feminist movement and unapologetic Zionists. And speaking of Zionism, because it does play a big part in feminists turning a blind eye to October 7th, you may not like the Netanyahu government, and this was alluded to earlier. You may call for an end to the settlements. You may condemn the carnage in Gaza, and many of us do. But, as the British writer Hugo Rifkin writes, there is a difference always between loathing the actions of a state and loathing the concept of it. One turning point was the 1975 Women's Conference in Mexico City. It was an ideological bloodbath in which delegates conflated Zionism with racism, neocolonialism, and imperialism. Thank you for coming. Bye now. It was ugly enough that Jewish attendees refused to talk about their experiences afterwards. And more than 40 years later, Jennifer Roskis wrote, "One need not scratch very deeply below the surface to behold an undercurrent which can prove unsettling to Jewish women. Expressions of anti-Zionism and of outright anti-Semitism raise the question of how Jewish women experience an apparent attack which calls their allegiance into question," close the quote. Some, like Linda Sarsour, have claimed that Zionism and feminism are incompatible. But Pogrebin said, and I think this is important, quote, "Zionism is to Jews what feminism is to women," an ongoing struggle for self-determination, dignity, and justice. As Pogrebin says, the progressives who did acknowledge the gender-based violence said it should be put into historical and political context, or said consider the complexity of the situation as if something could justify the mass torture and murder of women and girls. Those who support Hamas or remain neutral would never have remained neutral about Me Too sex predators. Violence is violence. And meanwhile, as has been alluded to, well-known feminists let down the side. I'm going to mention a couple more. Angela Davis signed an open letter referencing colonial feminism, and Phoebe had mentioned the anti-colonialist thrust of the left, and ignoring the sexual violence of 710. And writer and activist Eve Ensler, now known as V, was reported to have once said, quote, "We should all be hysterical about sexual violence," close the quote. Well, she's calm where Israeli women are concerned, and her V-Day website is silent when it comes to Hamas atrocities. So in conclusion, let me again acknowledge that you can condemn the carnage in Gaza and aspects of Israel's political system, but that is not mutually exclusive from taking a principled stand against October 7th. If you're calling for an unconditional ceasefire without demanding return of the hostages, including the women, people who are doing that should be asking themselves why. And as I said in an op-ed, I'm just going to finish with this. It's outrageous that feminists all over the world haven't come together to denounce October the 7th. It's also a betrayal of Jewish women. As it said at the top of one petition I saw, quote, "Women, your silence is unforgivable," close the quote. And we're still waiting for the outrage. We're waiting for denunciation of rape as a weapon of war, including when it happens to our sisters in Israel. I have the feeling we're going to be waiting a long time.
Thank you so much to both of our speakers. I'm going to stand here, otherwise I have to crane my neck. You've shed such an important and complex insight into this phenomenon, and it feels really like what you're both uncovering is a kind of chain of equivalencies or equivalences. Israel equals colonialism, equals, Western domination, etc., etc. And therefore, there's this kind of excuse, this is what Phoebe, I think, was saying, it's now considered hip and cool and the right thing to do to engage in open acts of anti-Semitism and harassment of Jews. For example, throwing things at Jewish businesses, paint, and so on and so forth. If I'm not mistaken, you were sort of suggesting that that's, or you were clearly suggesting that that's become normalized. And a lot of it comes down to what both of you were saying, which is a complete misunderstanding of the situation. And this kind of this simplistic bifurcation of oppressor and oppressed, which has also infiltrated the feminist movement. And I'll just start with a question before I open it up. To what extent, and if we can really detach these two things or disentangle these things, it comes down to ignorance, or it comes down to anti-Semitism, or it comes down to both, or it comes down to the fact that anti-Semitism and ignorance go hand in hand. Because I myself have been a long-time member of the radical left until recently, when I've also been completely alienated and frankly disgusted by the response. And I've gone through my own transformation over this period since October 7th, trying to figure out where I stand, formerly being very critical of Israel, despite having been there, on the tail end of the first Intifada, and so on and so forth, and seeing the destruction. But there was this expectation to hate Israel. And I never quite got there, because I had family members there, and certainly didn't jump on that bandwagon, but I felt that pressure. But I myself, as a Jewish person who spent 6 months in Israel, on a kibbutz, who has family in Israel, had no idea what was actually going on, what the history really was. And so inadvertently, I may have been participating in kind of on the margins of an anti-Semitic movement, because we now regard anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism as inextricably linked, as you also pointed out, as Einat Wilf and others have also suggested. So I'd just like to kind of go back to, I just wanted to share that with you to provide a little context for my own experience and how what you say just kind of reinforces the importance of knowledge and the fact that on the one hand there seems to be just this mechanism of anti-Semitism that reactivates, as Einat Wilf suggests, reactivates and now has kind of taken a different form that's considered acceptable, but that it's always there under the surface. And to what extent it's due to this kind of lingering anti-Semitism that's embedded in Western civilization, or it is due to people not knowing what the history is. So that's for kind of a general question for both of you to open the discussion.
Phoebe, you want to start off?
Sure. I mean, I could probably address it pretty quickly. Thank you for that response. That was very helpful, and it's great to hear all of this. Yeah, basically, I would say education is what has brought people to Zionism and to anti-Zionism. I don't think I know people who grew up, Jewish in pro-Israel households, who went to grad school and now they're anti-Zionist. So I think obviously it depends what you're reading. It depends. Certainly, if you're talking about like conventional higher education in North America today, I do not think that an absence of that is really what's at stake here. What I do think, though, is that misinformation in a different sense can play into it. So people who are getting their news off TikTok or whatever and are just sort of seeing things through memes may be seeing things in less nuanced or sort of less nuanced ways, but also less aware of the world prior to 5 minutes ago, which is, I think, a little bit why you get people who just, even October 7th itself seems unfathomably far in the past for people who are living only in like what they last saw online. So yeah, but I don't think ignorance, I mean, I think the problem is you see people with all different views on this at all different levels of sort of how informed they are. It just depends what it is they are reading. I think that may be what I've got on that.
That makes a lot of sense. It's kind of algorithmic anti-Semitism that's unwitting in some cases, we might say as well. Yeah, the algorithm is telling people what to read, and so they're being exposed to certain things and not others. Thank you. Yes, please.
I think it might be a combination of some ignorance and anti-Semitism. And when you gave the 4 choices, I could take door number 3, I think, which was ignorance, I think. And I'll explain that by talking about narratives that have been created. And maybe some of these narratives do come out of ignorance, I think. I'm on a campus, right? I'm at TMU, formerly Ryerson, Toronto Metropolitan University. We had a teach-in for Palestine, and Hamas at that teach-in were being described as freedom fighters, among other things. The acts of October the 7th were spoken about as resistance. So is it ignorance or is it interpretation? In another, it's almost like I was saying to Danny as we were driving here, for me it's like a parallel universe, although it's probably more than that, where you can even take the same set of facts and create a totally different narrative using the same set of facts. So I'm not sure if you want to label that as ignorance or just a will, a needing to create a story. And if you're on the left, and I used to consider that my political home too. I think a lot of us have been very shaken. But if you're looking at the facts And then it depends on your sources. I'm living, and I shouldn't be, on Twitter, now called X, and I can't believe what people are saying. So is that ignorance, or is it the need to believe the worst of Israel, you know, to call it always the genocidal apartheid state? It's deeper than ignorance.
Sure, yes.
Yeah.
So Marcia and I and some of the people in the room, we work in an institution. And where are the institutional apparatus in all of this? So we have a women's and gender studies program here, and I don't know if anyone from that program is here. They certainly knew about what we were doing today. And we also have programs in social justice. And where are those female activists? Well, I don't know that any of those people are here. So what's going on in institutions of higher education where it's their jobs? They have a mandate to respect human rights, to be non-discriminatory, to create a safe environment for everyone. Why the silence? You know, especially in women studies and gender studies, why are those people silent?
Yeah, either of you want to take?
Why are they? I think the answer to that is most people who choose to enroll in those programs are on the left, and everything that Phoebe said and Zipporah has said and I've said, I think apply to those kinds of departments. You don't have too many conservatives say, you know, sort of waking up and saying, okay, of all the majors I want to take, this is the one. So you've got a majority of leftists in programs like that. And what do you think, Phoebe?
Yes, I mean, I think I think academia, so I should say, yeah, I come at this from a sort of a background in academia. And yeah, I think academia has been kind of at the forefront of that type of thinking. Conversely, it's a little bit behind the curve sometimes in terms of broader culture war stuff. So what so-called wokeness, whatever you want to call it, seems to be still very huge in academia, even as it's kind of on the wane in the mainstream society and in media and so forth. So I think it's just that overlap of being sort of early in some ways and late in others. Academia is just not maybe the best spot for some of this. Yeah.
But to follow up, what would you say about the silence of these institutional units and anti-Semitism?
I think it's not surprising in the least. Fighting anti-Semitism has become right-wing coded. So people who don't want to be right on the right don't want to be part of fighting anti-Semitism.
And there's a denial of left-wing anti-Semitism?
Well, that gets into people just sort of. This is a broader question about hypocrisy and how teams form, and you get this a lot. Like, so this was something I was going to go into. If I realized I was going on too long, I didn't want to speak longer. But basically, you get a lot of discussions about like free speech, and you get each side saying it's the other side that's curtailing free speech. And I mean, I think that is just kind of a human universal of, you know, calling out the bad thing when the other side is doing it. So I don't think. Personally, I don't think that saying there's only one real anti-Semitism and it's left-wing, or there's only one real anti-Semitism and it's right-wing is all that productive, especially now when you see right-wing white supremacist types saying, oh no, actually what I care about is Palestine, and they've just rebranded, basically. So yeah, I'm not so, that's basically my thought on that.
The universities, just to add to that, the universities make the right noises. No university president or provost is going to say that they're in favor of anti-Semitism, but you really have to look at the actions that they take and what are they supporting, what are they closing down, what free speech are they actually friendly to, and what free speech are they trying to squelch?
And I think it comes down to how we even understand anti-Semitism as a civilizational force. So going back to Einat Wilf, I'm not sure how she pronounces it a lot, but the scapegoat. So there has to be a scapegoat, and the scapegoat is always already the Jews. Right now, you can say the left would frame it as scapegoating Israel and the Jews, but Israel has become the scapegoat. It represents all the sins of the world. It's colonial, it's racist, it's Western, etc. Right? And then, so I think that's what's at play as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that I think that we in this room are people who take for granted that anti-Semitism is a form of bigotry. I don't think everybody in the world sees it that way. And a lot of people really, at this point, it's clear, see this as punching up. They see it as akin to somebody saying that like anti-white racism is a thing, like what about men? What about white people? They see it like that type of category, right? And I think if you're talking about universities specifically, are Jews considered a marginalized group? Well, it kind of depends, and often no. And if you're worried about the oppression of a group that isn't considered by the left to be marginalized, then that does not get sort of protected in such environments.
That goes to what you were saying about intersectionality, which was a brilliant insight. Where's the intersectionality when it comes to Jews, who are a historically oppressed group, and feminism, right? So that, if I understood you, were suggesting that they're not, because Jews are considered white and colonial, etc., so that they're not given the same attention. In fact, they're left out of any.
Right, pretty much, yeah.
And Phoebe, you made the really important point earlier that sometimes when people think they're punching against Jews, in some way they're helping Palestinians. So that makes it even more acceptable.
Thank you. Yes, please, go ahead.
I just wanted to make a comment that when you're inside an area, sometimes you think that what's happening is specific to you. And I just want to comment that, if you look at the theory of guerrilla warfare and national liberation movements, you can see over and over from the 1950s the same dynamic that you're seeing where people say Hamas is resistance. So that was one of, Che was one of the starters of it, but basically the role of guerrilla warfare is to hurt the people. Basically, they're trying to provoke the government into suppressing the people so that the people then revolt. So it's quite cynical. So it's basically what their goal is to make things worse for people.
To destabilize.
That's a sort of technical word. They want the people to suffer more so that they will revolt in general, because they're not strong enough to control. So they're trying to provoke the government into suppressing the people enough that the people now take over. So that's sort of cynical. But if you look at those movements from Africa, Frelimo, ZANU-PF, you look at FARC, you look at Barbundu Marti, they've all done violence and evil at the same level that Hamas does. But they were similarly praised by people in the West, particularly the left, as being national liberation movements. Now, I don't know of any record of them doing sexual violence, but their level of brutality among two local civilians was similar to what Hamas does. And similarly, the left sort of said, oh, they are national liberation movements, and they just completely looked past. They didn't focus on the brutality that was part of the dynamic there. And so, when I look at what happened here, what people are saying about Hamas and saying, oh, they're resistance, you see that 50 times in every country in South America, every country in Africa, every country in Asia, the same sort of, when you pick the part you like the national liberation part, you sort of ignore all the other parts. And so this is, to me, this is more consistent with that whole thing in the past, which means to me it's a deeper problem. It's a deeper problem than just this presentation of it. But and if you're on the left, you overlook that when you talked about, Guatemala, you talked about, Venezuela, Colombia, part. You overlooked that then, but now it's hitting you, and now you don't want to overlook it, So, that's just a comment that that means to solve this is deeper than just thinking about Hamas. It's in the education system, there's something underneath there that it's really hard for people to hold two or conflicting ideas in their head. It's hard to be opposed to certain policies of the Israeli government and at the same time be in favor of Israel in a certain way. Those two sort of conflicting ideas, and that goes through Hamas and the Palestinians, everybody. There's conflicting stuff here, and people just have a hard time having both of those ideas in their head. And so they latch onto the easy one, which differs depending on the person. I was too unrelated.
No, I'm sorry. No, I just want to, because apart from the fact that Hamas is completely represented as a liberation organization who has done nothing for the Palestinian people except for put them deliberately in harm's way. So if we're talking about a liberation organization, and why is all the money that they're getting from these various state organizations not going to building schools and hospitals, but is going to build
But that's actually the same
right.
as all these other organizations,
Right.
as I said. It's happened. This is not a unique example.
Right.
It's almost a universal practice of what we call these liberation organizations.
I think, I think that's really important to put on the table. And also the point about what Hamas is not doing to liberate the Gazans. And I do think here, what we're focusing on that makes this a little different is the sexual violence. When you have a feminist movement that has been so focused on microaggressions and sort of every other aspect of sexual violence, and somehow when it comes to this, this seems a little different from the other examples. I mean, there was Boko Haram, and that's been mentioned, Barry Weiss mentioned that, and it's been mentioned here. And feminists rallied for that. Well, that was easy, yeah. This is complex. This has layer upon layer. So I'm glad you put that on the table. What do you think, Phoebe?
Thanks, Marsha. Yeah, so I think there are a couple things here, sort of two separate pieces. One is the place of the left in the broader culture. So yes, you would always have, as I'm thinking, I shouldn't be thinking about the Woody Allen movie Bananas, but I am. But the point is, you've had, there were always people on the left in the West who would romanticize, violent movements elsewhere and say, isn't that really freedom fighting and wonderful? What you didn't used to have is a sort of mainstream sense that that's actually the good side to be on. And I'm thinking about just this idea that you can now protest a bookstore, a bagel shop, whatever. And that's actually, there were always a handful of people who felt that that was an appropriate way to act. And now you just have a lot more. So I think one thing is really, yes, this place of the left in the broader culture beyond just, a social justice department at a university or something like that. The other question is this idea of people not being able to keep multiple things in their head at the same time, and this idea of how can you object to things that are happening in Israel, but not object to the existence of Israel, things like that. I think certainly if you look at Israel itself, plenty of Jewish Israelis object to how their country is run. So the idea that it's inherently, I don't know how anybody who pays attention to this topic at all would land on the idea that criticizing the Israeli government is inherently anti-Semitic. However, what I do think you get is when when there's an extremely loud contingent in places like Canada saying, ceasefire now so that Israel is wiped off the face of the earth, that has to happen immediately. If you're somebody who maybe wasn't for a ceasefire on October 8th, but is wondering, on April 4th, when is this war going to end? You don't really want to align yourself with the people who were calling for a ceasefire before a war had even started. I mean, before Israel had joined it, as it were. Yeah.
That really speaks to the political homelessness that a lot of us feel, that there's this compulsion to choose a side or the other, and that the complexity itself is denied or refused. So you can't occupy a position of nuance, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's why it's wonderful to have speakers like you here, because you are, you are occupying that position of nuance. Do we have any other questions? Yes. Oh, is that a hand? No. Yeah.
I wasn't sure what to say. I was thinking, well, maybe I, as a non-Jew, and like an ally, as Perla likes to call us. How can we help? How can we be part of this conversation and support you and yeah.
What a lovely question. I would say, do what you're doing. You notice when you go to pro-Israel protests, virtually everybody there is Jewish, based on certainly what I see. And when you see the pro-Palestinian, as Danny would say, the pro-Hamas demonstrations, everybody is not Gazan, right? So we really need allies at a time like this. Another concept Danny and I discussed in the car, moral courage. Just speaking up and supporting where you can. Speaking of which, is anyone here who is not, other people who are here who are not with the Brock Coalition against anti-Zionism? I know there was one person here earlier, but I'm wondering, are there other people who came in? Or you're all with the coalition? Oh, well, thank you.
Jewish community in Niagara.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming. But I do think we're speaking to each other far too much, and we're agreeing with each other far too much. So when we do have allies, just that the kind of support I mentioned is really helpful.
I can only agree with what Marcia said, and also just this goes for Jews as well, but basically not every time something Jewish comes up, having to sort of segue into a big conversation about Israel and Israel's actions and so forth. I'm thinking specifically of a recent Guardian restaurant review where the restaurant reviewer reviews a Jewish deli in London and then has this whole long hand-wringing segue about the war, and I don't know if he's religiously Jewish or just of Jewish background. He's talking about his own whatever, and it's just just review the restaurant, you know what I mean? And I think sort of just letting Jews be is the ideal. I would prefer that to a whole, I don't want to be sort of woven into, I don't need to be sort of brought in as an official marginalized group. I just think I don't want somebody sees, somebody Jewish, this is a bagel, this is, let's now discuss Netanyahu and his decision-making processes. No, that's just not helpful. So yeah, I think that's what I would like.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm not Jewish. One thing I've observed is that, I think I've mentioned this with Ed, I've talked to Ed about this, is I think Jews should just admit they lost this because they lost attention for 40 years. They thought they had won. They felt a lot of this was passed, and I'm talking North American Jews. And, I've seen Jewish people I know all of a sudden become political where they had never been. But as a small minority, I don't think the Jewish community was as active as other minorities because I think they had the feeling that, okay, it's over, we won this, we're in there. And so all of a sudden, it's just no, you didn't win it. It's going to be, it's sort of like a more eternal fight. And a lot of people in the Jewish community will have to reinvigorate, or not reinvigorate, they'll have to spend a lot more time than they want to spend doing this, just like people in the other, minority communities. And so that's what I've seen as a difference related to this, is a lot of people, my interpretation is that the Jews I know thought they had won this and had never thought they would have to be active in their life to fight it. And so that created an open, vacant field. It was then populated by someone that had more energy, in particular the Palestinians, but they've been working on this for 30, 40 years, right? And so, you're not going to win this battle. If you decide to take it on, you're not going to win it in a year or 2 or 3. It's it should be like a 40-year plan, in a sense. but more activity by people that don't want to think of themselves as, or haven't in the past thought of themselves as political or needing to be political. I don't know, Ed, I totally agree with that, but I'm revealing things I've told Ed.
Yeah, 2 points, because that's interesting. 2 points. First of all, the point about Jews not being political, which is a separate point from Jews not being political around Israel. There is a concept in Judaism called tikkun olam, which means improvement of the world. And I think, in general, Jews are extremely active and have been in many, many social justice movements, in liberal circles especially, until recently, very much in leftist circles. Across the political spectrum, I think Jews have been extremely politically active. Now, the second point, about thinking they've won the battle. Maybe there has been a bit of naivete or complacency among, say, North American Jews or Jews in the diaspora, because it has felt, we've all grown up with stories of, both my husband and I have told each other stories of our dads walking to school, mine in London, England, my husband's in Ottawa, and being called dirty Jew and all those kinds of aspersions. So I think a generation beyond my generation has been really aware of anti-Semitism, and those of us who were born after the war, after the Second World War, have maybe been a little naive and maybe have relaxed, as you say, to paraphrase you, feeling that, yes, we have a place in the world, and also Israel is always there. It's always a safe haven. And psychologically, the sense of Israel as a safe haven, no matter what happens, has been very, very important. So maybe what you're seeing is Jews engaging over the concept of Israel, because for many of us, it's the first time that we've actually seen the foundations being shaken in a way that we haven't maybe in earlier decades.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, so I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective, which is from Jewish media. I have not always worked in Jewish media, but I've been at the Canadian Jewish news for a little bit. And there has been a tremendous amount of interest in the fight against anti-Semitism in recent years, to the point that it often, to me and to some others, who are in this field, seemed a little overwrought, and it, if anything, seemed a little bit like this was the only thing that all Jews could agree upon, right? Was, we don't want to be hated, so you can't agree on exactly where to be religiously or, politically in anything more specific, but anti-Semitism, definitely bad. We all hate anti-Semitism. Fair enough. So there has been a ton of, in terms of outreach, what motivates outreach in the Jewish community, a lot of it has been extremely focused on anti-Semitism, to the point that now it gets a little bit awkward because there actually is this explosion of anti-Semitism. And it's not like what happened after Trump was elected president, where there were a lot of Twitter trolls and a few really horrible incidents, but not this huge wave, right? So I think I would just say that this has been certainly on the agenda of a lot of the organized Jewish community in Canada and elsewhere. The other thing I would say is, if you zoom out and look at this from a bigger historical perspective, yes, absolutely, moments like this make people realize that they're Jewish and care about it in ways that they hadn't before. I'm thinking specifically about the Dreyfus Affair in late 19th, early 20th century France, where a lot of people who maybe didn't feel all that Jewish suddenly felt pretty darn Jewish and became politically active, sometimes Zionist, indeed, at that time. And I do think that that's especially interesting when you think about this idea that if you do things like stand outside of an Indigo and protest it, or stand outside of Cafe Landwehr or whatever and protest it, that that'll be what makes Jews join the anti-Zionist cause. And yes, there are like a million articles about the like 3 anti-Zionist Jews. I understand that, you know, they get a lot of attention, but the fact is, I think this is going to make Jews more pro-Israel. It's not that I think it should or shouldn't. It is. That is just how these things work. So I don't know that this is like something that needs to be sort of instructed. I think this is just the way this works. Yeah.
Do you have any other questions?
Yes, please. I hope I speak loudly enough, but I think that what I wanted to ask about is essentially the opposite of allies. It's one thing to stand up to people who spew hatred that you have to deal with, that we all have to deal with in our daily lives. And it's an entirely different process when this is somebody that you love. When it's somebody who, in every other issue you've come across, as we've talked about already, you've agreed with. How would you recommend trying to have these discussions with people who you do care about, who you, for whatever reason, cannot cut in real life?
I don't know if I have good advice, but I'm thinking about this in two ways. One is the advice that one gives one's 4 or 5-year-old when they're having difficulties with a friend, which is sort of you don't necessarily have to sort out that relationship. You should just make more friendships and foster those and try to invest more in those. And you can still have the other friend, but, you know, and yes, I understand that leads to the siloing of people politically to some extent. If you really only ever talk to people who agree with you, that's not great. But if you're being tormented by the fact that it seems like everybody in your life thinks one thing and you think something else, maybe having a community of people who see things as you see it can be sort of healthy. And also I have, I'm going to be very American here and give some marriage advice because we from the States are a little more socially, I'm not socially conservative objectively, but you know, it's a more socially conservative culture, whatever. Don't marry somebody where your ideas about this topic are totally different. Because then you would be just like, that is just life advice. So young people, don't do that. And I'm not saying I did that. I certainly did not. But I'm saying that's just, don't make your life miserable over this. Yeah.
I think that's a nice note to end on. And I think I would just add to that mix that maybe to suggest to people to be careful what they wish for. Because if they're saying, you know, if there's applauding Hamas on the streets of New York and Toronto and so on and so forth, do they really understand what Hamas represents and that its outburst of violence was not just an outburst, but it's part of their ideology, which is deeply misogynistic and deeply violent and deeply hateful. So that can be a tricky thing to say, but I think that's somewhere in the conversation as well. So I'd like to thank our panelists for today. Thank you so much for your wonderful contributions to this discussion. Thank you for everybody who showed up. Thank you also to Ed Sternin and to Danny Rosenberg for putting this all together in the first place. A round of applause for everybody.